The Sea of Japan is not a forgiving place to run an operation that depends on the assumption that the other side is not watching. It is a body of water bounded on three sides by coastlines that belong to nations with sophisticated surveillance capabilities, crossed by commercial shipping lanes dense enough to provide acoustic and radar cover for almost any vessel that chooses to blend into the traffic pattern, and deep enough in its central basin to support submarine operations at ranges that compress the warning geometry for any surface vessel operating without active escort. The combination of depth, traffic density, and strategic proximity to three simultaneous competing naval powers makes it, by the assessment of every analyst who has studied it seriously, one of the most complex surveillance and interdiction environments on the planet. It is also, for those same reasons, one of the most attractive environments in which to attempt something that has never been attempted before, because the complexity that makes surveillance difficult also makes doctrine assumptions dangerous. When an operating environment is complex enough, the assumptions embedded in the doctrine begin to carry more weight than the actual picture. And assumptions, in naval operations, are the place where catastrophic surprises are born. The assumption that would come closest to being catastrophically wrong on a Wednesday morning in the Central Sea of Japan had been embedded in U.S. Navy boarding and inspection doctrine for 11 years. The assumption was this: a civilian cargo vessel flagged to a neutral nation, operating on a registered commercial route, conducting itself in accordance with maritime law, and responding appropriately to all hailing communications does not constitute a primary threat vector to an escorting warship. It is a search and interdiction target, a potential carrier of contraband, of illicit cargo, of material subject to sanctions enforcement. But it is not a weapons platform. The inspection protocols built around that assumption were designed for the discovery of concealed cargo. They were not designed for the possibility that the cargo was a weapon pointed directly at the ship conducting the inspection. The MV Chongjin Star was not named after the North Korean city. It was flagged to a Southeast Asian nation whose maritime registry had, over the preceding 6 years, processed 17 vessel registrations linked through corporate ownership chains to entities that U.S. Treasury Department analysts had assessed as fronts for DPRK state enterprises. The Chongjin Star's registration had been processed 18 months earlier. Its ownership chain terminated through 4 intermediate holding companies registered in jurisdictions with minimal transparency requirements, in an entity whose beneficial ownership had never been formally established. The vessels declared cargo on this transit, machine parts and industrial equipment destined for a port in Russia, was consistent with a category of trade that had been a documented vector for sanctions circumvention logistics for years. It was, on paper, a vessel worth boarding. What was below the waterline of the Chongjin Star, in a modified ballast tank section that had been welded into the vessel's hull during a period in dry dock at a facility on the North Korean East Coast 14 months earlier, was not machine parts. It was 2 Yugo-class midget submarines, each carrying 2 lightweight torpedoes, each crewed by a team of 4 operators selected from the Korean People's Navy's Special Operations Force. The ballast tank modification had created a flooded internal bay accessible from below the waterline through a reconfigurable hull aperture. A door in the ship's bottom that could be opened while the vessel was underway to release the midget submarines into the water beneath the hull, invisible from the surface and masked acoustically by the cargo ship's own propulsion noise. The concept had been in development for 9 years. It had been inspired by a historical precedent. The use of modified merchant vessels as covert weapons platforms was documented in the intelligence records of multiple nations across multiple decades. But the specific technical architecture, the miniaturized submarine deployment system, and the operational geometry that made the concept viable against a modern naval escort vessel represented a genuinely novel capability development that no current U.S. Navy threat assessment had formally attributed to the DPRK's operational inventory. No assessment had attributed it because the dry dock modification had been conducted inside a covered facility. The hull aperture mechanism had been tested in an enclosed coastal inlet, using acoustic suppression protocols that had limited the detectable signature of the testing program to a level that the collection assets monitoring North Korean naval activities had not been able to distinguish from routine coastal engineering activity. The midget submarines themselves had been transported to the Chongjin Star's loading pier in sealed containers, indistinguishable from the industrial equipment the manifest declared. The 4-person crews had boarded the vessel at night through the engine room access hatch, while the pier was under visual access control. The operational plan was built around the boarding inspection protocol that U.S. Navy destroyers applied to vessels on the DPRK sanctions monitoring watch list. The protocol required the boarding vessel to approach to within 200 meters of the inspected vessel in hold position, while the visit, board, search, and seizure team transferred by rigid hull inflatable boat. During the VBSS transfer and the initial boarding phase, the escort destroyer's position relative to the inspected vessel was constrained by the operational requirement to maintain visual coverage of the VBSS team and communication with the boarding officer. The destroyer would be committed to a fixed position at a predictable range for a minimum of 12 minutes before the boarding team's initial deck assessment was complete. 12 minutes at 200 meters. That was the window. The midget submarines, releasing from the Chongjin Star's hull aperture the moment the destroyer committed to its holding position, would be in the water beneath the cargo ship and running toward their firing positions before the VBSS team had completed its ladder ascent. The cargo ship's propulsion noise, maintained at a level sufficient to mask the midget submarine's departure, would cover the acoustic signature of the release. By the time the submarines reached their optimal firing positions, approximately 400 meters aft and to the sides of the destroyer, the VBSS team would be on deck conducting its initial assessment. The destroyer's crew would be in the divided attention posture that a boarding operation always created, and the firing window would be open. The plan had one additional element. At the moment the midget submarines launched their torpedoes, the cargo ship's crew, 22 individuals, all DPRK nationals operating under the cover of documentation identifying them as citizens of the vessel's flag state, would activate a pre-installed electronic countermeasure package concealed in the vessel's communications room. The package would generate a broadband noise burst on the frequencies used by the destroyer's sonar systems for the 4 seconds immediately following the torpedo launch, creating a detection gap designed to eliminate the final seconds of warning the crew might otherwise have had. The plan had been briefed to the Korean People's Navy Command Authority 14 months earlier. It had been approved. It had been prepared. It had been refined through 3 tabletop exercises conducted at the operational planning level and 1 partial live test conducted in a controlled coastal environment, using a decommissioned surface target. The test had produced results within the acceptable parameters. The operation had been assigned an operational window during which a suitable candidate vessel on the U.S. sanctions monitoring list would be identified and the operational team positioned. The Chongjin Star had entered the operational window 23 days before the Wednesday morning, when the USS destroyer assigned to the Sanctions Monitoring Patrol received a tasking order to intercept and board a vessel matching its description operating on a course that would take it through the Central Sea of Japan. What the DPRK operational planners did not know was that the operational window had been identified. Not the plan, not the specific vessel, not the midget submarine architecture. What had been identified, through a signals intelligence collection effort that had been running for 7 months against the DPRK Special Operations Force command network, was a pattern of encrypted communication traffic that described, without explicitly stating, an operational preparation cycle. The communications were encrypted at a level that resisted full content recovery. The DPRK's encryption protocols for special operations communications had been substantially upgraded following an assessed compromise event 2 years earlier, and the current architecture was genuinely difficult to penetrate at the content level. But the traffic pattern, The timing, the routing, the communication partner relationships, the volume signatures, told a story that a signals analyst working the overnight collection review at 3:15 a.m. on a morning 6 weeks before the Wednesday had assessed as consistent with a pre-operational coordination sequence for a maritime special operation of unusual complexity. Her report did not specify what the operation was. She did not know what it was. Her report specified what the signals pattern was consistent with, what the estimated timeline suggested about an operational timeline window, and what category of targets the communication partner relationship pointed toward. The partner relationship analysis, the mapping of which nodes in the DPRK military communication network were exchanging traffic with the Special Operations Command node, included, as one of several possible interpretations, the Korean People's Navy's Midget Submarine Operational Command. The report reached Pacific Fleet Intelligence at 6 a.m. By 10:30 a.m., it had been cross-referenced against 11 months of accumulated analysis on DPRK Special Operations communication patterns and against a separate thread of collection concerning anomalous dry dock activity at a North Korean East Coast facility 14 months earlier. The dry dock activity thread had previously been assessed as routine maintenance. The cross-reference produced a combined assessment that rated the possibility of a DPRK maritime special operation involving a modified vessel with a concealed underwater capability as sufficient to warrant a protective protocol modification to the sanctions boarding procedures operating in the Sea of Japan. The modification was classified and quietly distributed to the relevant commands. It changed the boarding protocol in one specific way. Before any VBSS team transfer to a designated board and search target, the escorting destroyer would conduct a passive acoustic monitoring hold at a range of 1 nautical mile from the target vessel, twice the standard approach distance, for a minimum of 20 minutes before reducing range for the transfer. The monitoring hold would use the ship's hull-mounted passive sonar in a configuration optimized for detection of small, slow-moving underwater contacts in the immediate vicinity of the target vessel. 1 nautical mile. 20 minutes of passive listening. This was the only change. From the outside, the modified protocol would appear to be a cautious approach posture. Nothing that would tell an observer that the specific threat being anticipated was a miniature submarine in a ballast tank. At 6:47 a.m. on the Wednesday morning, the destroyer identified the Chongjin Star at 14 nautical miles and began its intercept approach. At 7:12 a.m., the destroyer reached its 1 nautical mile holding position and established passive acoustic monitoring. The VBSS team was ready on the fantail. The rigid hull inflatable boats were in the water, engines running at idle. Standard procedure would have moved the ship to 200 meters at 7:15 a.m. The monitoring hold ran. At 7:19 a.m., 4 minutes into the hold, the sonar operator reported a contact. Faint, intermittent, a low-frequency mechanical noise signature from a point source approximately 80 meters beneath the Chongjin Star's keel, on a bearing consistent with the vessel's internal hull structure rather than its propulsion system. The contact lasted 11 seconds, faded, returned for 3 seconds, and faded again. The sonar operator classified it as possible mechanical. Could be cargo shifting, could be internal machinery. But the frequency profile was inconsistent with any cargo shifting or machinery operation she had seen in the reference library for vessels of the Chongjin Star's class. She flagged it at 7:21 a.m. The sonar supervisor reviewed the recording. He ran it against 3 separate classification libraries. The closest match in any of them was not a cargo vessel internal system. The closest match was a hydraulic actuator operating at low pressure, the kind of actuator used in a hull door mechanism. He called it to the Combat Information Center at 7:22 a.m. The watch officer in the CIC had read the modified protocol briefing. He had read the intelligence assessment that accompanied it. He did not need more than 4 seconds to decide that the monitoring hold would continue, and that the VBSS transfer would not happen until the contact was resolved. He also authorized, at 7:22 a.m. and 14 seconds, the deployment of the destroyer's hull-mounted active sonar in a downward-looking configuration, a mode rarely used against a surface vessel, designed to map the underwater profile of a target directly beneath the ship. The configuration was used for mine detection operations. It had never, to the watch officer's knowledge, been used during a boarding inspection. He used it now. The active sonar pulse went out at 7:22 a.m. and 31 seconds. It mapped two objects attached to the underside of the Chongjin Star's hull that were not part of the vessel's registered keel and ballast architecture. Each object was approximately 11 meters long. Each had a propeller configuration visible in the acoustic return. Each had an aperture in its forward section consistent with a weapons tube. At 7:22 a.m. and 44 seconds, the watch officer had the picture he needed. The VBSS transfer was canceled. The destroyer began backing to increase its separation from the Chongjin Star. The ship went to general quarters at 7:23 a.m. At 7:24 a.m., the Chongjin Star's hull aperture opened. Both midget submarines were in the water within 90 seconds. Their operators, working from a pre-computed approach geometry, began their runs toward the destroyer's projected position. The position it would have occupied if the boarding had proceeded on the original timeline. The position it no longer occupied? The destroyer was 300 meters farther away than the midget submarine's firing solution required. The additional separation was not comfortable. 300 meters in the engagement geometry of lightweight torpedoes fired by miniature submarines in shallow coastal water is a margin, not a certainty. But it was enough to allow what happened next. An MH-60R helicopter that had been assigned as the boarding operations overhead cover, holding at altitude 2 nautical miles away, carrying Hellfire missiles and a dipping sonar system, received the general quarters notification at 7:23 a.m. and immediately repositioned to an active prosecution posture. Its dipping sonar was in the water at 7:25 a.m. and 12 seconds, acquiring both midget submarine contacts within 40 seconds of deployment. The contacts were moving. Their approach geometry, extrapolated from the track data, placed their firing solutions opening at 7:27 a.m. against the destroyer's original position. At 7:26 a.m. and 34 seconds, the helicopter dropped 2 Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes targeting the eastern midget submarine. Simultaneously, the destroyer's own lightweight torpedo countermeasure system, a deck-launched torpedo, specifically configured for close-in underwater threat prosecution, fired against the western midget submarine at 7:26 a.m. and 41 seconds. The eastern midget submarine's crew had approximately 20 seconds between the moment their passive sonar registered the Mark 54 acquisition ping and the moment of impact. The submarine attempted an emergency sprint and hard turn to starboard. The Mark 54's active seeker tracked the sprint noise without difficulty. The engagement was completed at 7:27 a.m. and 03 seconds. The eastern midget submarine was rendered inoperable at a depth of 140 feet. The western midget submarine's crew had a different problem. The deck-launched torpedo from the destroyer had been fired at a range that gave them less warning time than the Mark 54 gave the eastern crew. 11 seconds between first detection and impact. The western submarine attempted to release its own torpedo before the intercept could complete. The torpedo left the tube at 7:27 a.m. and 08 seconds, running toward the destroyer's position on its pre-computed solution. 7 seconds later, the deck-launched torpedo achieved contact with the western midget submarine. The engagement was complete at 7:27 a.m. and 15 seconds. The torpedo fired by the western midget submarine was in the water, running, aimed at the destroyer's original position, the position the ship had been at before it began backing away. The torpedo's onboard active guidance acquired the destroyer's hull at 7:27 a.m. and 22 seconds and began tracking its actual position. The destroyer had backed 560 meters from the original holding point. The torpedo had enough fuel remaining to close that distance. The torpedo defense officer authorized the direct intercept countermeasure at 7:27 a.m. and 31 seconds. The same system that had prosecuted the Western Midget submarine fired a second round at the incoming torpedo. The countermeasure torpedo and the incoming weapon closed on each other at a combined speed that left a margin measured in meters. The intercept occurred at 7:27 a.m. and 48 seconds. The detonation happened close enough to the destroyer's hull that the pressure wave registered on the ship's underwater sensors as a significant acoustic event. The kind of reading that would have triggered a damage assessment alarm under any other circumstances. The duty electrician in the forward engineering compartment felt it through the deck plates and reached for the damage control panel before the all-clear assessment came through 17 seconds later. No hull penetration, no flooding, no structural compromise. The detonation had occurred close, not close enough. At 7:28 a.m., the electronic countermeasure package in the Chongjin Star's communications room activated. 7 minutes and 20 seconds after the timeline it had been designed to support. The broadband noise burst it generated covered the destroyer's sonar frequencies for 4 seconds, exactly as programmed. The destroyer's sonar picture blanked and recovered. The contacts it had been tracking were already resolved. The jamming was noise in an empty room. At 7:29 a.m., the destroyer's boarding team re-embarked the rigid hull inflatable boats and returned to the fantail. The VBSS transfer was not rescheduled. The Chongjin Star was directed to heave to and await the arrival of a second U.S. Navy vessel and a joint law enforcement boarding team operating under a separate legal authority. The cargo ship complied. Its crew of 22 was detained pending investigation. The communications room equipment was seized. The hull aperture mechanism was documented and photographed by Navy divers who arrived at 10:15 a.m. Recovery operations for both midget submarine hulls began at 11:30 a.m. The recovery produced intelligence material that the technical teams would assess over the following 4 months as the most significant advance in U.S. understanding of DPRK Special Operations submarine capabilities since the 1996 Gangneung incident. The engineering specifications of the hull aperture mechanism, the propulsion system's noise reduction architecture, and the weapons tube configuration all provided data points that updated substantially and urgently. 6 separate threat assessment documents covering Korean People's Navy capabilities. At 2 p.m., the destroyer resumed its patrol station. The watch rotation proceeded normally. The crew's after-action reports were filed, classified, and transmitted to 7th Fleet within 3 hours. The accounting: 1 modified cargo vessel carrying 2 concealed midget submarines, 2 midget submarines released from hull aperture, 1 torpedo fired by Western midget submarine before intercept, 2 Mark 54 torpedoes employed, 1 deck-launched countermeasure torpedo employed against Western submarine, 1 direct intercept countermeasure torpedo employed against the fired weapon, 1 pressure wave detonation close enough to register on hull sensors, 0 hull penetrations, 0 ships lost, 0 U.S. casualties, 22 Chongjin Star crew members detained, 1 electronic countermeasure package activated 7 minutes too late, 1 modified boarding protocol that moved the destroyer 1 nautical mile further than the firing solution required, 1 hydraulic actuator acoustic signature at 7:19 a.m. that matched nothing in the library except a hull door mechanism. The DPRK operation had been built on 9 years of concept development and 14 months of specific preparation. Its architecture was technically sophisticated, operationally patient, and aimed precisely at a doctrinal assumption that had been embedded in boarding procedures for 11 years without examination. The assumption was not wrong in most contexts. In this context, it had been wrong enough that the plan had been designed around it. The plan failed not because the assumption was corrected. It was corrected, but only partially. and only because a signals analyst had noticed a communication pattern that did not specify what she was looking at. The plan failed because the correction, imprecise as it was, moved the destroyer far enough and kept it listening long enough that a hydraulic actuator made a sound at 7:19 a.m. that a sonar operator decided was worth flagging. In the geometry of maritime special operations, 11 seconds of faint mechanical noise and the decision to question what produced it separated two outcomes whose consequences were not equivalent. The destroyer sailed the Sea of Japan that Wednesday afternoon because someone listened carefully to a sound that lasted 11 seconds and decided it did not belong there. That is the discipline. That is the margin. That is the standard that the Sea of Japan demands of every vessel that crosses it with a crew that intends to return.